all, Lossien here, and today we're gonna be making, oh, silly me, I dropped my glasses. Jinkies. Velma!
So today we're making Velma in one day. Our first step is going to be making the skirt pattern based on your measurements. Then we're going to sew the skirt panels together and do the hem. Then we're going to take it over to the iron and just pleat. This takes forever. Then we're going to attach the waistband to the skirt and put that aside. The next step is to make the pattern for the sweater. Then we're going to sew the sweater together. And after that, we will try on the skirt and the sweater together and make any adjustments we need to. Then we will adjust the skirt, and after that we will adjust the sweater. And the very last two steps are making the sock pattern and then actually sewing the sock.
So unfortunately, I forgot to film this part before we started actually making the costume, so I've just got small amounts left. But for the sweater, we're gonna want a fleece or something like a fleece, a jogging fleece, like a big chunky knit, something with a bit of body. Fleece is great because it's got just a little bit of stretch one way, which we can use to our advantage, and it also means we don't have to put in any zippers or anything. I ended up getting the length of my body that I wanted, so from about here to like midway down the thigh. She's got a long one. Add probably half a foot, so about 6 inches for seam allowance and hem allowance. You're going to want another about half a meter for the neck piece. It's quite large. And then for the sleeve, I did the length of the sleeve so I could get the sleeve and the socks together. Always add like an extra half meter or half yard on the very top of that, just in case. For the skirt, I had this lovely red from my stash. I didn't actually have to buy anything. But if you're going to get something, you want any sort of non-stretch, nice, plain red material. A twill is great, although it can be expensive. A lot of times there's cheaper things that are on sale. You don't want anything that's too flowy. You want it to be able to hold a pleat. So you can definitely talk to your local fabric people about it and they can help you. I do not recommend anything like broadcloth or quilting cotton. The issue being that the moment you sit in those, they're gonna get all these creases from sitting, and those are never gonna go away until you iron it again. And with a pleated skirt, you want it to hold the creases you want, not its own creases. For the amount, there's just a couple things to think about. One, what is your widest measurement? Is it your waist or your hips or anywhere in between? That's what you're gonna wanna use, and you want 1.5 times that. Now, that's only if you can fit the whole thing from about the waist to the knee, and an extra 6 inches or so for the waistband on the folded fabric. If for some reason you're very tall and you can't do that, then you're actually going to want to get 3 times the amount instead of just 1.5 times the amount, because we're going to calculate it with the fabric folded. Okay, so we are making Velma. Let me be clear, this is the fast and easy one-day build. This is not the correct way to make a pleated skirt. This is just the super duper fast way. I'm going to measure around my hips, which is the widest part of what the skirt has to cover. I believe it's a 40, let's double check that. Thereabouts. And I'm gonna measure the length that I want, which for me is about 19 inches.
So I want 3 times that 40 inches, which equals 120 inches in total.
Since I want 120, I need about 60 inches plus seam allowance here to get 2 lengths. Now I'm going to use the hem that's already here so I don't have to worry about going too crazy. So let's give myself a new line here with seam allowance space. Then I'm going to measure up from here that 19 that I wanted and add a seam allowance at the top. So that actually puts me at 21, we'll say, all the way across. And I wanted a 60 length. So down here at the 60 mark, we are going to draw that straight up and measure up the 21. And we're gonna measure that all the way across 21 and connect it. We do have to add a bit of seam allowance to this outside edge, but we already have the seam allowance on the top and bottom, so we don't have to worry about it past that. And then I can just connect these lines, and we have the main part of the skirt. And then we also need to make a waistband. Oh, so the waistband's just going to be the 40. I'm gonna give myself an extra inch so it can fit over my hips, so that's gonna be 41. And since this is in half, I just need 20 and a half. I can measure it right across here. And then we have to decide how wide we want the waistband. It really depends on your width of elastic. I find that giving like a full 4 inches is enough for seam allowance and a fairly wide elastic. We're gonna add the seam allowance on the 2 sides. And because this is doubled, this is 2 pieces with a fold line in the center. So that's gonna fold like that and have our front piece and our back piece. And then this big long piece, we're gonna pleat. So we can cut out the skirt. Really straightforward. As I said, this is not like a how to make a perfect pleated skirt. This is a, oh my goodness, the party's in 2 hours or whatever, and I need a costume skirt. And there's our skirt ready to go. So starting with the skirt, we're gonna take the waistband and just put that to the side for now. And then we're gonna look at this. There is no right and wrong side to my fabric. So what I'm going to do is called a French seam. I'm gonna sew both sides together one way. Now it's a giant tube, and I'm going to trim the fabric right close to that stitching line on both those seams. Then I'm gonna flip it the other way around, inside out, and sew these seams again, but I'm gonna sew just past the seam allowance so that the seam allowance is trapped in the new seam, and we're gonna do that on both sides. Now you can take a moment and iron these if you'd like. I am a bit of a chaotic sewer and doing this quickly. And we're going to do the other side as well. And now this is the outside. So the next step we're going to do before we take it to the ironing board to do the pleats is actually to do the hem. Because we're using this nice hem, all I've got to do is fold it over twice and stitch it all the way around. This way when we do the pleats, even the hem is facing the correct way. And all I'm doing is folding the selvage so that the complete selvage is folded, and then folding it again, and then I stitch at that top folded edge. Now if you want like a wider hem at the bottom, it will lie nicer, but I'm going quick and with the fabric I had. Now when I come to the seam where it's a little bit off, I just kind of split the difference and fold that. And we're halfway done. And when it comes towards the bottom, since it's already sewn, I just kind of straighten it out, use my finger to make it line up, and away we go. Pull it taut, it will just kind of make itself right. And now we have to go iron that and put the pleats in. It's time to do the pleating. We're going to iron the bottom as we go, and I'm just going to make this as easy as possible. I'm going to make my pleats 2 inches wide, because then all I literally have to do is, now I like to start at the side because I'm going to hide this seam in a pleat like that. And I'm going to pin it in 3 spots, 1 middle-ish, 1 top, 1 bottom. Now in looking at her, She has one box pleat in the front and then it knife pleats to the side. I'm just doing all knife pleats. This is the easiest way. You're just gonna complete this all the way around. If you wanna do a box pleat, all you'd have to do is you would then do this like this, and then start the next one like that. So now I go right here. I can kind of see where my other pleat ends. I'm gonna pick up the next one, pull that out, and pin it in 3 spots, and just do this all the way through. So for the very last one, I'm just going to kind of eyeball it and make it as similar as possible so that it looks right, because it's not, my math is a little off, or I didn't do it quite right. But again, this is a quick costume, not a perfect costume. I wouldn't be entering this in masquerade. All right, let's go put the waistband on. The very first thing we're gonna do is stitch down all of these pleats around the top, and that keeps them from undoing. Make sure to take your pins out as you go. And this is going to make sure that the pleats are all laying the right way, they're not folded back on themselves, that sort of thing, so that when we put the waistband on, we're not fighting against the pleats. I like to leave the pleats in the rest of the skirt just to make it easier to deal with it until after we've tried it on. So next, I'm going to take my waistband and connect it on the 2 sides. I'm going to take a moment and see if it is the same width as this. Yes, it is. Perfect.
And then we're just going to sew up the 2 sides of the waistband, making one piece, one tube out of it.
Then I'm going to figure out where my side seam ended up. Okay, there's one side seam. Line it up. I'm going to stitch this together all the way around, making sure that my pleats do not fold. That's the big trick with something like this. It's making sure that your pleats are always laying flat, because if it folds now, it's going to be folded forever. So now it's relatively easy. We're just going to fold this under, fold like this, and stitch in the ditch all the way around. Now, the other trick we're going to remember is we are going to stop stitching about here so that we can put the elastic in. So you can actually turn this inside out to make it easier. And we're going to stitch with our good fabric, our red on top. I'm running very low on red thread, so here's hoping that there is just enough. And you can go through and pin this if you're more comfortable with it. I'm just gonna, and we are stitching in the ditch, which means we are stitching in this seam between the waistband and the rest of the skirt, so that we don't even really see it. And the other thing is, I'm just eyeballing it to make sure the waistband looks right, because it is gonna be hidden under her sweater. Now, unlike the sweater, this fabric definitely does fray, you can see, so I'm tucking it under, making sure that it is just past where I want to sew. You can also iron this if you are more comfortable. I'm doing this quick and dirty. Perfect. Next, we're going to grab a safety pin and our elastic. Now we're going to feed this elastic through. This elastic is what's comfortable around just below my waist with a little bit of stretch to it. I like to feed the elastic, or the safety pin, through the elastic, and we're just gonna start going here. And basically you're pushing the safety pin through and then pulling the elastic. And before I get too far, I'm going to take a pin and pin this to the skirt here so it can't go anywhere, so it doesn't like end up inside, because the elastic is smaller. We're doing just a elastic waistband. And the other trick is you want to make sure that the elastic doesn't turn around. You want it always facing the same way up and down. That's what's going to be the most comfortable. We are almost out. And there we go. So now I'm going to hold this carefully, take out this pin, put these together and pin them. And we're gonna try this on to make sure it fits correctly before we sew that up. So the next step is taking out all of the pins that hold all the pleats down so that we can try this on properly. And what's left of Ms. Velma but her sweater. So I'm just using a fleece. It's nice and easy. Let me just check. It is wide enough that we can double this up. So I have folded it in half because we're going to cheat the front and back at the same time. Selvage is just past the fold. And you can do this so that you don't have a seam down the back. We can just do it on this side. Because we want this to be a bit baggier, it doesn't have to be nearly as perfect as our Daphne.
As you can see, I started by measuring from my neck point, where my shoulder meets my neck, to my bust point, then from my bust point to my waist point, and then from my waist all the way down to my hips. And then I marked those measurements down in order along that double fold line so that we would have a spot to start the pattern on the front and the back. I also double checked how far down her sweater actually went, and it went about halfway between the hips and the knees, so I used that measurement and put that down too.
And I'm going to add a little extra because I can always take it off.
From those little marks, we're going to draw straight out horizontal lines perpendicular to that fold, and this is just the guide that we're going to mark our measurements on. Our next step is going to be marking the bust, and I just took 1/4 of the bust measurement and then also 1/4 of the hip measurement and marked those both down. Mine were actually fairly similar, so I didn't have to worry too much about the difference. And you always want to give yourself a little extra because we do want this to be baggy. I ended up doing about 1/2 inch on each side.
And then for my waist, I'm going to eyeball it to be in only slightly, making sure, of course, that it is enough.
Remember, this is 1/4 of your waist measurement.
And we're kind of curving in just slightly that top third of the waist to hip line. Now, she does have a chunkier sleeve than Daphne did, so I'm only going up 2 inches at the underarm. I like to measure on myself and make sure that's right. Now, for the collar, I'm measuring from my center neck to that bone in my shoulder, making note of where my neck ends.
And then we're going to mark those down, coming from the center out, doing the neck and then the shoulder mark.
And then we always go 1/4 of an inch up at the inside neck, 1/4 of an inch down at the outside neck, and connect those, or outside shoulder I should say. Make a right angle on that new line and then connect in a J shape. Now this is where things get a little interesting. We're gonna go down 1.5 for the back. Oh, I should be more careful with my floor. And we're gonna go down 3 for the front. I like it to be fairly out. Now I'm actually going to take the neckline out a bit. So I've brought it out about 1 inch along that new line that we've drawn. And I just scoop from those 2 lines at the front and make that into a right angle. And that looks like it's a little too tiny for me. So I'm going to give it slightly dropped shoulder, which means I'm drawing this line continuing out about that same inch. And then I'm just going to connect it back to the J. And there we have the body of the sweater. I'm going to cut that out before we work on the next part, adding all my seam allowance. And I'm giving a slight notch at the waist so I can line those up. So to cut the necks, I'm cutting along the back neck first. I'm going to mark that notch. Then I open it up, fold away the piece inside, and I'm going to cut the front neck marking out. So now I have a front piece and a back piece. We're going to keep this nearby so that we can measure the arm size and the neck sizes. So let's just place that to the side, and we're going to do the sleeve next. So she's got a bunched up sleeve. I like to do like a full length sleeve and then I can push it up myself. I find that most comfortable.
To make the sleeve, we're going to measure the arm from the very top all the way down to the wrist, and I'm marking that line down and then going up about 2 inches at the bottom so that I can actually put my cuff on. I'm also marking where the elbow is, and then on top of that I'm marking 8 inches down from the top because that's approximately where we're going to have our bicep line. That is where it is for most people.
I'm going to measure what this is. That's about 11, good to know.
And the next step is just drawing horizontal lines on all of those marks except for the very top, so that we have something to measure on. So I'm going to take my bicep measurement and add 1.5 inches so that it's baggy, then divide that by 2. So that means that I have half my bicep measurement plus 0.75, and I mark that down on the bicep line. Because I want it to be baggy and push up the sleeve, I didn't want to do my actual wrist measurement as that is quite small. So I did about 1.5 to 1.75 of my wrist measurement, almost double, took half of that and then made a mark and then connected that all the way up to the bicep line. For the scoop of the arm, I'm actually taking the measuring tape, and because my measurement of what it was on the body was 11, I'm adding about 1 inch and using the measuring tape to make a bell shape and then trace that down.
I'm making sure that this bell shape I'm making is flat across the top and flat, like a right angle at the bottom and a perpendicular at the top. And then I make sure that my measuring tape, instead of saying 11 inches, it says 12 inches. So that gives me just a little extra. I'm also going to make a cuff for this. And that's going to be let's add a little seam allowance down here so I have it. And that cuff is going to sit here, so we're going to actually use this measurement on my forearm.
I'm going to take off about 1/2 inch from the total measurement, then divide that by half and measure it out from that folded edge. Now this fabric has a tiny bit of stretch, that's why we're taking out just a little bit. Now I did mine about 2 inches wide, and I doubled that and then put seam allowance on both sides so that it can fold in half.
And it's a nice plain cuff with only one seam. There we go. So we are going to measure, that's 7 and 6 are my 2 finished measurements, so that's not including the seam allowance. 7 and 6 together is 11. Not quite enough to fit there, so we're gonna have to come down here. So first things first, we always add that seam allowance along the bottom. We're gonna come from here out 11.
On that line I drew straight up and also added seam allowance on the outside there.
And then our front neck was 6. I like to mark that down, but I have a little notch where the shoulder goes, so I can line it up correctly. I'm gonna have a seam in the very back, which for me is fine because you won't see it. You can play around with it and put the seam on the shoulder instead. It's just whatever your preference is. Now I am going to double check how tall, oh, hers is so tall. I'm gonna measure my neck. It's like 4.5. Wow, which would put us at 9, okay. So I'm going to mark my double that and the halfway mark. So I measured what the height of my neck was, which was 4.5, and I marked that down. Then I doubled it and marked that down as well, because we want the neck piece to fold over.
Then I just added seam allowance to that top edge as well, and then also put in the notch for the shoulder seam.
And then we can cut this out.
Now, as always, sometimes I add seam allowance, sometimes I don't. Please feel free to take the time to add seam allowance if that makes it easier for you in your cutting.
Center top notch of the shoulder seam so we can sew it together easier. And we will need that centered notch here on the bottom for the sleeves. And we're gonna mark that halfway point here as well as here. So we've notched where the fold is and where this fold will be. And there we have it. The sweater is cut and ready to be basted together and tried on. And now we're gonna make Velma's sweater. Now, normally we'd be basting everything together, trying it on, making sure it fits, but because hers is actually like a larger fit, I'm going to actually sew the whole thing together except for the hem, try it on, mark the hem, and then be good to go. If I need to make any adjustments, I will be able to do so. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually the cuffs while I have the sleeve here. And what I'm doing is I'm opening it up to the inside, and I'm gonna take my cuff and unfold it and sew here to here. Now you can see there is a bit of size difference.
So to make this actually work, I'm going to stitch the first bit, and because it's fleece, I'm going to stretch the cuff so that it equals the notch together. And this just gathers the bottom in just a little bit, which is exactly what we want. Now, if yours doesn't stretch like that, like there's too much material there, what you can do is run a basting stitch, gather the basting stitch in so it's the same length, and then do it. So we've got one sleeve, and we're gonna do the same for the other sleeve here. Then I'm gonna put the sleeves to the side just for a couple moments. Next is going to be the body. I'm going to open it up so the top is on the bottom, and I'm going to sew along the shoulder seams. And then I find the easiest way to put in sleeves is at this point you open it up. Always make sure that your seam allowance is pointing towards the back. You're gonna take one of your sleeves and line up that center notch, making sure it's the right way, so it's good side to good side with that spot there. And then because this sleeve is a little wider than our armhole, as we sew, we're just gonna stretch the armhole just a bit and not stretch the sleeve at all, just for the first little bit, and then you walk them together, see that they match up, and sew them together. If you're not comfortable doing that, the other option is to baste the sleeve and gather it at the top just a little bit and then put them together. This is just the quick and dirty way, because Halloween is coming. So then we flip to the other side so that the sleeve is on the bottom, and this is the back. And this time, since my sleeve hole is on the top, I'm gonna stretch the top as we go. And then I'm gonna find the other sleeve hole here and do the same on the other side with the other sleeve, making sure that it's good side to good side. Now, if we lay it flat so we see the sleeve here, we can connect the armpit to the armpit, and the sleeve connects all the way down. So you can start at the armpit, go up the sleeve, down the body, and the same on the other side. I'm doing this, again, the quick and dirty way, so I'm gonna start on the sleeve, and I'm just gonna sew all the way down this seam. And I'm gonna make sure that all my seam allowance is pushed up into the cuff. And I'm gonna make sure that the armpit matches up and just kind of stretch these a little bit so that they're the same length. And I like to open up the seam at the armpit so the top seam allowance goes up and the bottom seam allowance goes down. It's up to you. It doesn't really make a difference. And then as we continue down, we can match up the waist notches and all the way down to the hem. And then we're gonna repeat on the other side. And now we need to add the neck. So we're gonna set this aside for a moment, pull out the neck pieces. So we have these two neck pieces. We're gonna sew all the way along one edge, the long way, because this is gonna be our hem. So we're gonna match up all of our notches. And then we're gonna trim this seam allowance because we don't want this much bulkiness in there. Kind of doing this collar like a giant cuff, so in a very similar way. Then we're gonna open up and put those seams together and stitch along the side there. And this is going to be our collar. And it folds down like that. It's a big collar. There's a lot of collar there. So now we're going to take the piece that's going to be the outside. So when it's unfolded, it's this piece here. This is going to be the back, and we're going to line it up on the inside of the center back of the neck here. We're gonna sew all the way around. These notches here line up with our shoulder seams. I'm gonna put a notch in the very front so we know where that center front is. Very important. And we're gonna go all the way around.
We want to make sure that that shoulder seam allowance is pushed towards the back. It just lays nicer. There's a lot here, so just take your time. Lining up those center notches. And this folds down on the inside. We're gonna line up all those seams again. Hang on, I just gotta mark that center front again. Starting at the back, we are actually going to stitch this down, and we're gonna try and stitch it directly on top of where that stitching line is. I like to do it from the good side, so I'm just going to, from the outside, pin this in a couple of key spots all the way around. Starting with the very back, then I'm going to line these up on the side seam. And I'm gonna line up my center front. Now, the good thing about using fleece is fleece doesn't fray. So we don't have to worry about this coming off and fraying. If this did fray, you'd have to fold it under and stitch, but we don't have to worry about that. And then we're just going to, with our fingers, check it out here, put in a couple extra pins along the way. Then we don't have to think about it. This is one of the few times I will use pins, because once you get it into the machine, it gets really tricky to hold it in place when there's this much extra fabric. And I'm just using my fingers to make sure that the seam allowance is pointed up the way we want it to, and that it covers past where I'm pinning. And the last little bit. Okay, and I'm gonna start at the center back and go all the way around, stitching that down. And we're stitching in the ditch, which means that we're stitching in that seam of the neckline. So I'm pulling out my pins before my machine goes over them, because you do not want to sew over your pins. That's a great way to lose a sewing needle and have it flying everywhere and potentially into your eye. And also, I don't know about you, but whenever I'm doing last minute things, I don't have enough sewing needles, so I want to keep them all. And there we go. Now, for the sleeves, you could do the same thing. That's actually really tricky. I've been thinking about this, so I'm gonna flip them back the other way. I'm gonna fold this in half, and then I'm actually just going to sew it to the seam allowance all the way around, just to keep it folded in half. Again, this is not the correct way to do it. This is just the way that's the easiest. That's not gonna have you cursing everything. This way you still have a nice finished cuff, and you don't have any seams poking out of your cuff. Now, when I get to the edge, very edge, I can't do that sewing, so I'm just doing it as close as I can. And there we go. Let's do the same on the other side. There we go. We'll try it on and mark where we want the hem, and then all you have to do is do a double fold down, and it's done.
Now I do apologize, I was way off screen on this. The mirror was not my normal mirror, so next time we'll get it better. Now I ended up taking in the skirt, that elastic that we left unstitched and just pinned. I just pulled it through a little more and pinned it till it sat nicely. This ended up raising the skirt so that the hem was where I wanted it to be, and was much easier than redoing the hem and then having to re-iron all of the pleats. Then after that, I put on the sweater and ended up pulling up the bottom until it sat where I wanted it to on the skirt, and pinned that so I knew where I wanted the hem to be. And then I realized that I needed to take it in just a little bit at the waist. I know that hers is baggy, but she still does have a bit of a figure, and I wanted that as well. So once that was done, I just pinned it on both sides, and it was ready to take back to the sewing machine. Starting with the skirt, I trimmed the extra elastic away, and then I kept it together where that pin was, making sure that it was laying flat all the way around. Then I took that to the machine and just sewed back and forth along that elastic a number of times, just making sure that it was really stuck together and wasn't going to go anywhere. Then I just pulled on the elastic and that actually pops it into the casing. And all you have left to do is stitch in the ditch that last little part and sew down that open part of the skirt. And the skirt is done. So the first thing I did looking at the sweater was decide how wide I wanted the hem. I prefer on shirts like this a wider hem, it sits nicer without flipping. I ended up going with like an inch and a half. I thought it looked quite nice. Once I knew that that was the length of my double fold, I put a notch at that top fold because all that bit was going to come off, and that actually gave me an easy way of doing it. Then I unpinned the whole thing, laid it flat, and used that notch as a guide to cut all the excess off all the way around. And then the easy part. At one of the seams, the side seam, I folded open all the seam allowance and then folded it over twice, that amount that I had decided it was going to be. You can see I double checked. And then I just stitched it down that amount all the way around. And the trick again with doing a hem is making sure that you're stitching on that folded edge towards the rest of it as much as possible. It helps with all the flipping issues. When I got to the other side seam, I also opened the side seam so that it would lay nicer and it wouldn't have quite as much material to go over. And of course I trimmed my threads. Always trim your threads as you go. It's going to make your life a million times easier, trust me. The next step was taking in the side seams, so all that I did was find where that pin was, go onto the inside, grab a piece of chalk and mark where that pin was on the inside, on both sides. Then I could take out the pins on the outside, look back on the inside, and know exactly where those marks were and how much I had to take in. The next step was simply sewing that amount in. Now you can also pin the beginning and end. I just kind of started a little bit above, a few inches, curved gently in to where that mark was, and then curved gently back out about 3 or 4 inches. Then I trimmed all of my thread and also trimmed off all the extra fabric now as if there was seam allowance. So I just left the seam allowance behind, and then I repeated everything on the other side. And with that, all that was left was the socks.
Okay, sock time, which I almost forgot about. So we're gonna do this with a foot. I'm just wearing socks for comfort because it's a little chilly. Our fleece, a bit of elastic, and safety pins. It's important to use safety pins. If you try and use straight pins, there's a good chance you're gonna accidentally stab yourself. And here's hoping I have enough of this. Ooh, it's gonna be tight. I think one of my socks is gonna have a seam on it. So literally, I'm taking a scrap of this fabric, and I'm definitely gonna have to seam together a piece on the other side. I'm going just past my toe, and I'm gonna start with my heel. Now, this fabric has a bit of stretch, and we wanna make sure the stretch is going around, like this way, not up and down. And I'm just stretching it a bit over my heel, and I'm going to pin it all the way through and back out. And then as you can see, I'm just going along with my fingers and putting it together. Now I am going very tight to the top edge there because I want to use the least amount of fabric possible. So that's perfect. Edge, I'm actually going to pin, let's not catch the sock, across it, match the shape of my foot. So I've pinned across following my foot. Yes, you can see the tiniest bit of the sock. And then up here, I'm just kind of pulling it so that it's smooth. And I'm not going to make it as tight in the ankle because we need to get the ankle or heel past the ankle part. And I don't want to put in a zipper. And I'm gonna pin all the way. You don't have to put this many pins in. I just like to do this so that when I take it off, I can make sure that it fits properly. Okay, and that's gonna be the top edge. So hers actually comes to about here. We want it just over the crest of the calf. And we're gonna end up putting elastic, but that's what's gonna help it stay, is putting it over that crest. Now, we're gonna attempt to take it off. Perfect. So that worked out quite well. And this is gonna be the top edge. We're gonna have the elastic. So we're gonna fold it down, but we need a bit extra to go past that. So our seam allowance is gonna be the width of the elastic plus a bit of seam allowance. And I'm just gonna cut this right across the top. This is about double what we need. We can always trim off extra after. And then, because we pinned so much, I can actually just cut alongside the pins as if they mark our edging. So I'm just giving myself seam allowance. And then we just have these two spots here. There we go. So now if we unpin this, and you can always actually take your time, draw it out first with chalk. This is just the very, very fast way of doing it. I'm gonna leave that top mark in. And if I take a look at this, yeah, so one of my socks is gonna have a seam up the front because I don't think that this is wide enough. No, I don't have enough fabric here. So I'm just placing this so that I have space to put a center seam there. So the top edge is a little off kilter, and that's because when I was pinning it together, I missed the tiniest bit and didn't quite have it laying perfectly flat. So we're just gonna trim that right now. All right, it's time to go sew this up. Should be pretty fast. So first things first, we're gonna sew down that line, and I'm gonna keep this piece on top so I know exactly where I need to sew, and I'm gonna sew just beside it. And it shifted slightly, which is fine. We're gonna trim away the extra seam allowance here. And the next step is I'm gonna sew all the way down the back. Now, when I'm sewing vertical seams, I always like to go in the same direction. So if I started at the top, I'll start at the top every time. And I went in a bit there, I think that's fine. We're gonna trim this seam allowance as well. And do this one. And we're gonna trim our seam allowance. Now we're gonna open this up and sew along the toe. And you want to make sure that you back tack, so you're going back and forth so that it doesn't unravel on you. Now I'm going to trim the seam allowance. And then we're just going to do the same on the other one. And I will say, because of the seams, these aren't going to be the most comfortable socks in the world. So if you can find socks in the actual correct color, that would be my recommendation. I'm just seeing that if we sew this along the top edge, fold it once and fold it a second time, it'll be the correct height. And that's easier than making a casing, putting it in and all that, like we did with the skirt. Now you don't want it flat, you want it to have a comfortable amount of stretch. So I like to just stretch it and see what feels good. Give myself a bit of do-over. I think I have a ½ inch on each side for the seam allowance. And then I'm going to use that as a pattern for my other calf. Now what I'm going to do is fold it in half and with a pin mark that halfway point. And I'm gonna put a notch in this one that does not have a seam. Find the halfway point of that piece of elastic as well. Now, starting just a bit past that back seam, I'm gonna go all the way around, and I'm going to make sure that this center part here gets pinned to the elastic. And actually this will be easier if we flip this the other way around so it's right side out. That way we're sewing on the inside so the machine is going the way it wants to go. And I'm going to place that like that. And when I sew, I'm going to sew along this top edge so it connects the elastic to the fabric. And you'll see here how the fabric is wider this way, has more to it than the elastic. So we're going to sew the first little bit.
And then with the needle down, we're just gonna stretch the elastic a tiny amount, hold it with 2 fingers, hold this fabric, and keep stitching, and keep that elastic stretched as we go. And now I'm just going to shift and make sure I have that overlap, pin the elastic at that beginning line again, so that we can stretch it ever so slightly and finish sewing this. I'm going to take the pin out and hold it with my fingers. And with the needle in the elastic, I like to just stitch the 2 elastic pieces together. Otherwise they tend to separate a bit at the bottom. And then we're just going to do the same thing with the other leg. So now I'm going to switch to a 2 forward, 1 back stitch. If you don't have that, you can use a zigzag. I would just make sure it's very small, because in the drawings this is just a very straight line. As you can see, what I'm doing is on the inside, I'm folding this twice, so once it covers the elastic, twice it covers the stitching. And we're going to stitch along this edge all the way around. And what this is going to do is just give a nice clean single line the same width all the way around here, and make it comfortable on the inside for you too. Now to do it this way, you do have to have your bobbin thread matching this color of fabric. If you don't, you will have to try and sew it from this side. So we're just folding it twice, and we will stretch the elastic just a little bit. And the 2 forward, 1 back stitch, I'm not sure what it's actually called, but it does lock itself so you don't have to back tack on it. And as always, we're going to trim our threads now. And there's our first sock. So let's do the other sock, just the top edge there. So there we go, a second sock ready to go. And now we are officially done the costume.
All in all, I'm really happy with this. The socks are not perfect. I'm probably going to keep my eye open for orange socks. That's way easier than making socks. I also dropped the shoulder just a little bit too much. You can see it's weird. So if I pull this down, it's fine. I think I just need to wash it a couple times and like have it relax. Otherwise, I'm going to make a note that don't put it down as far as I did. So, you know, live and learn. Other than that, I'd say she worked out really well. It's very warm, so it's perfect for Halloween if you're in Canada like I am. Yeah, I'm really happy. So this is where you can find me if you want to follow along on my adventures. I have over 20 years of photos and experience that go everywhere, and on top of that, I want to thank all of my patrons who put up with my crazy ideas and are so supportive, and without them I couldn't do what I do. And on top of that, next week we're leaving Scooby Doo behind and going into something a bit spooky, spookier. Do you know what it is? See you next time. It's Velma. Velma. Jinkies. I don't know why I said jinkies like that. I don't have a magnifying glass, so you know what? She can be pretty and sexy. I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm dying of heat, 'cause it is quite warm. Dancing's not helping.